You know that the night before Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Bnei Yisrael brought the first Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, and after that it became a annual observance. That first Korban Pesach is called Pesach Mitzrayim. Pesach was brought there in Egypt. The subsequent bringing of the Korban Pesach is called Pesach Doros, the Pesach for all generations. So the Mishnah in Pesachim of Tzadivov asks the question, what is the difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros? Are there any halachic differences? And the Mishnah points out four differences. Number one, that in Mitzrayim the Pesach had to be purchased 4 days in advance, on the 10th of Nisan. That halacha doesn't apply for eternity. Number two, in Mitzrayim the blood was placed on the doorposts and on the lintel using a bundle of azov and a bundle of hyssop. That halacha, of course, does not apply in future generations. Number three, that the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim was eaten b'chipazon, was eaten in haste. The people were dressed, wearing their walking shoes and holding their walking sticks, as if to show that they were about to leave. That doesn't apply in future generations. Number four, that the issur of chametz only applied for 1 day in Mitzrayim, that night and the following day. And Pesach Doros, there's an issur of chametz for 7 days. So those are the four differences that the Mishnah lists. The Tosefta, Maseches Pesachim, the 8th parak, lists a number of additional differences. I'd like to focus on two of them. It says in the pasuk that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told the Jewish people to purchase the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, he said that they should purchase it sel lebeis avos, sel aboyis. That every family should purchase its own Korban Pesach. If the family is too small, they wouldn't be able to eat an entire sheep, then it says that the family should join the next door neighbor. But the pasuk seems to imply that it has to be a neighbor. Either it's a korban for the family, and if the family is too small, then the family joins a neighbor, but not someone down the block, only the closest neighbor. Later in the parsha, when it talks about the Pesach Doros, it says in the pasuk that Kol Adas Yisrael Yasu Oso, that all the Jews should perform the Korban Pesach. So Rashi brings a mechilta that asks the question that what is the point of that verse of Kol Adas Yisrael Yasu Oso? So Rashi says, Loma Nemar, why does the pasuk tell us regarding Pesach Doros that the entire congregation brings the Pesach? Pesach Mitzrayim celebrates Avos. Because regarding Pesach Mitzrayim, it says that the korban should be purchased by families. Shemnimnu alav lemishpachos. They were counted in by family. Yochel af Pesach Doros came. I would have thought likewise the halacha should be so in the Pesach Doros. Here, everybody can join. Even people that aren't members of the family and people that aren't neighbors, they can also join. So the Tosefta quotes this halacha, which the Mechilta learns from the Psukim, and says that's also a difference. That in Pesach Mitzrayim, either the Pesach was purchased by a single family or a family with its neighbor, with Shcheino Akaravelav. But that's it. In Pesach Doros, there was a special halacha that everybody could join in. So you have to understand what's the basis of that halacha. Why is it in Pesach Mitzrayim it has to be specifically a family, or at least a family joining a neighbor, and in Pesach Doros it can be anybody, even a distant person. Korban Pesach. Another halacha that the Tosefta says is that in the Pesach Mitzrayim, everyone slaughtered the Korban Pesach in his own house, in his own property. There was no Mishkan, there was no Beis HaMikdash. So every person slaughtered the Korban Pesach in his own backyard. The blood of each Korban Pesach was sprinkled on the doorposts of that person's own house. Now the Gemara says, Gimel Mizbecha Sayu Mitzrayim. There were 3 altars in Mitzrayim. The 2 doorposts and the lintel, those are the 3 altars. So it was a private carbon. There was no central place where the carbon was brought. Pesach Doiris, so everyone brought their Korban Pesach in one place, in the Beis HaMikdash. Even if the Korban Pesach was eaten in separate homes, but the slaughtering of the carbon was in one central place in the Beis HaMikdash. So this, the Tosefta says, there's another difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doiris. The Pesach Mitzrayim was slaughtered, each person in his own private property, and Pesach Doiris, the Karbanos were slaughtered in a single place. One might have thought that that's simply a halacha in Karbanos generally. That once the Beis HaMikdash is built, once the Mishkan is built, all Karbanos have to be brought there. But it happens to be that is a special halacha regarding Korban Pesach. As we know, historically, there were times that Bamais were permitted. There were times that private altars were permitted. When the Mishkan was in Gilgal, when it was in Noiv and Gibeon, the halacha is that private altars are permitted. There's a special halacha, a special lo sas in the Torah, that even when Bamais are permitted, a person could not bring Korban Pesach on a private bama. It's a lo sasa in Parshas Re'eh. L'sucha l'zbayach ha'sapesach be'achad shorecha. There's a special lo sasa that even when bamas are permitted, you're not allowed to bring the Korban Pesach on a private bama. The Keren Oira in Maseches Zvachim shows that really there's a prohibition that applies to other karbanos as well. For example, the halacha is that the only types of karbanos that can be brought in a bama are voluntary karbanos. Obligatory karbanos can never be brought in a bama, such as the carbon chatas, for example. And the Keren Oira shows that really there's a lo sasa, a different lo sasa, lo sasa k'chol asher nachlo eisim po hayoim, different pasuk, which is a lo sasa, that tells me that obligatory karbanos cannot be brought in a bama. Yet there's a special lo sasa by Korban Pesach, meaning that there are many karbanos that are forbidden on a bama. But the Torah wrote a special pasuk by Korban Pesach. What's interesting, this pasuk is in Parshas Re'eh. The Sforno there asks the question, then why is it that the Torah singled out Korban Pesach, and this prohibition really is applicable to other karbanos as well? Why does it speak out Korban Pesach? So says the Sforno, because I would have made a mistake. I would have thought, since in Mitzrayim the Korban Pesach was slaughtered by each person in his own property, so I would have thought that as well you could bring the Korban Pesach even though it's an obligatory carbon on a bama. That's where the Torah wrote a special pasuk that the Korban Pesach cannot be brought on a bama. So this is another difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doiris. Pesach Mitzrayim was slaughtered in separate places, and Pesach Doiris is slaughtered in one place. Now I think this has consequences. Now the halacha is that a carbon yochid, a private carbon, is not doicha Shabbos. Can't be slaughtered on Shabbos. It's not doicha Tumah. If the Kehanim are Tameh, the carbon can't be brought. A carbon tzibur, a public carbon, is doicha Shabbos and doicha Tumah. It can be brought on Shabbos, and even if the Kehanim are Tameh, if there are no Kehanim that are Tahar, they can perform the avodah. Tumah hutra b'tzibur. What's the halacha of the Karban Pesach? Karban Pesach is also Darchei Shabbos and Darchei Tumah. So why is that? So Tosfos in Yuma, Davov, based on the Gemara in Yuma, Daf Aleph, says the reason that Karban Pesach is Darchei Shabbos and Tumah, even though it's really a Karban Yachid, is because given the Asi B'Knufia, since it's brought in an assembly, to Karban Tzibur Dami, even though it's really a private Karban, each family is bringing its own Karban Pesach, but since it's Asi B'Knufia, it's brought together at the same time, it's considered like a Karban Tzibur, has all the halachas of a Karban Tzibur. But it seems that it's only the Pesach Doiris, which is Asi B'Knufia. Only the Pesach in future generations, everyone brings it together. But in Mitzrayim, where each person slaughtered the Karban in his own property, so it wasn't a Knufia. It wasn't brought in an assembly. Because each family brought its own Karban Pesach in its own backyard. They ate it in its own house. So it wasn't a Knufia at all. It was mamish a Karban Yachid. So this idea that the Karban Pesach is a Karban Tzibur, is considered a public offering because it's Asi B'Knufia, L'chara only applies to Pesach Doiris. But Pesach Mitzrayim really is a full-fledged Karban Yachid. It's a private Karban because each family brings it privately on its own property. We have to understand what is the idea behind this. Because why does Pesach Mitzrayim have a certain quality of being private, and the Pesach Doiris is considered public? That's why it's brought in one place, and that's why everyone can join in, right? Even if you're very, very distant, not related at all. Whereas in Pesach Mitzrayim, it's very private. It's brought on your private property, and even the partners who join for the Karban, if they're not members of the same household, have to be neighbors and live in proximity. How do we understand this difference? In Parshas Vayirkra, we have the Arba Lashonos of Geula, the four expressions of redemption. And of course, we all know that the four cups of wine we drink at the Seder correspond to these four expressions. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll take you out from under the burdens of Mitzrayim, and I'll save you from having to work. I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great judgment. And I'll take you as a nation. It's the fourth expression. I'll be your God. And you shall know, I am the Lord your God, who takes you out from under the burdens of Mitzrayim. And really there's a fifth expression. I'll also bring you to the land which I promised to your forefathers, to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. In the past we've talked about this. There's an opinion in the Mishnah Psachim that l'chatchila, preferably a person should drink a fifth cup, and the Ravid says that the rationale behind that opinion is because that opinion counts behevesi. Also is one of the expressions of Geula, and we talked about in the past years why our custom is to disregard the behevesi. But these are the expressions of Geula. How do we understand the various expressions? So in the past we've said it from the Maral. The Maral points out that in the Gzeira, in the decree of the Golos Mitzrayim, there really were three stages. Because the Kodesh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu that Yedo Ateda, you should know, Ki ger yeh zaracha, your children will be strangers in a strange land. That's the first level, Geirus, being strangers. Then it'll become worse, Va'avodum, they'll be enslaved. And then V'inamosim will be tortured. So the Gzeira was imposed on Klal Yisrael incrementally. First, when they came to Mitzrayim, they lived as strangers. That itself is not pleasant. It's not pleasant to be a foreigner, an alien in a strange land. Then it got worse. They became enslaved. And then the slavery was escalated to the point of torture. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed the Jews, the reversal of these three stages also was incremental. So first Hashem says, I'll take you out from under the crushing burdens of Mitzrayim. That's a reversal of the inui, of the torture. Then it says, I'll save you from having to work. that's a reversal of the avdus. And then the go'alti eschem, I'll redeem you, that means I'll take you out. That's a reversal of being gerim. No longer will you be strangers in a strange land. You'll be removed. So the three lashonos, the first three lashonos, really are the reversal of the gzeira. So what are the next two lashonos? So v'lokati eschem li la'am, I'll take you as a nation. Of course, there's a reference to Ma'amad Har Sinai and the giving of the Torah. That's when we became God's nation. And v'vesi eschem la'aretz, of course, there's a reference to the coming to Eretz Yisrael. The question is that why are these last two expressions considered lashonos of geula? Isn't the process of redemption complete with the first three? As soon as the Jews are no longer tortured, they're no longer enslaved, and they're no longer strangers, because they've been liberated, they've been taken out of the land, at that point they're free. The geula is l'chara complete. The giving of the Torah, the coming to Eretz Yisrael, that's beyond redemption. That's a more advanced stage. So why do Chazal speak of these as four expressions of redemption? According to one girsa, they're called arba geulais, for redemption. Why is the lokati eschem li la'am, I'll take you as a people, referring to the giving of the Torah, why is that considered one of the acts of redemption? Another question on the Pesukim is as follows. It says, Ve'vesi eschem la'aretz, I'll bring you to the land. Excuse me. It says, lokati eschem li la'am, I'll take you as a people. V'yidatem, and then you will know, ki ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am the Lord your God, hamotzi eschem mitachas siblos Mitzrayim, who took you out from under the crushing burdens of Mitzrayim. Which means after stage 4, you will know that I am the one who accomplished stage 1. After the Haitzesi, and after the Hitzalti, and after the Go'alti, and after the Lokati, you'll know that I'm the one that achieved the Haitzesi. But after stage 4, you'll believe that I am the one who accomplished stage 1. So the question is, that's pretty odd. You're going to have to go through all 4 stages of Geula before you appreciate the fact that it was the Ribono Shel Olam who achieved the first. We would have assumed that as each step occurred, everyone would understand that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu pulling the strings. After all, it was accomplished through miraculous plagues, miracles. So of course we should assume that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was doing it. So why is it only after all 4, then you'll look back and you'll understand that really was HaKadosh Baruch Hu who even accomplished the first? What is the obstacle to belief at the outset that only after the process is complete, you've gone through all 4 stages, will you recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who accomplished the first stage? So with the idea of freedom, the philosophers who have spoken about the idea of freedom make a distinction between what they call negative liberty and positive liberty. Negative liberty being the idea that I am free from external coercion. No one is stopping me, no one is preventing me from exercising my rights. That is freedom in a negative sense, that I am free from anybody imposing his will on me, anybody who's trying to stop me from doing what I would like to do. But that's not the ultimate freedom. There was a person, for example, could be free from external constraints and yet still not have the resources or the opportunities to achieve his ambitions. Let's say you have a person who is a member of a minority group who once upon a time was not allowed to enroll in a university. So there was an external constraint. The doors to the university were locked to the members of this minority group. And now there have been court decisions, and there's been a civil rights movement, and now the doors are open, you're free to enroll. So the external constraint has been removed. But let's say the system did not provide for this individual to receive the earlier levels of education necessary to gain admission. So, for example, he doesn't have an elementary school education, therefore he couldn't get a high school education. So So the fact that the university doors are in theory open, there's no constraint, the doors aren't barred, nevertheless, he's not going to be able to achieve his ambition because he just doesn't have the prerequisites to be able to enroll and be successful in the program. So there's another aspect to liberty, which is positive liberty, meaning that not only am I free from external constraints, but as well I have the resources and the opportunity with which to realize my ambition. Now, we've talked about this in the past regarding the very, very interesting connection between wealth and freedom. We've pointed out in the past that many of the minhagim that we practice at the Seder, which the Poskim call Zecher Lecheirus, that they commemorate and allude to the idea of being free, really have nothing to do with freedom the way we conventionally think of it. They really relate to wealth. There was haseba, reclining. Right? Reclining is not symbolic of some political right. Reclining is luxurious. This is how the wealthy people used to eat in the olden days, and therefore it alludes to a certain opulence, a certain being well-to-do. To us, the connection between that and freedom is very hard to understand. Because how does reclining, how does living like a luxurious Roman nobleman, how does that relate to being free? And we explained that it is exactly this, because a person is not really free if he has no money. In other words, a person may have the political rights and he's spared from any external constraints, but if he doesn't have the material wherewithal to realize his ambitions, he's not really free. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu, that the Bnei Yisrael not only are going to be liberated from Mitzrayim, but they'll leave with great wealth, meaning they'll have the ability to realize their ambitions, to realize their goals. And therefore, our observances, which are Zecher Lecheirus, also related to wealth and opulence, even if we happen to be not so well-to-do. But at the Seder, we act as if we are all millionaires, the upper crust of ancient Roman society. So we have these two aspects of freedom. We have the negative liberty, which is freedom from external constraint, and we have positive liberty. It's pashut that the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the first three stages of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Hitzeisi, the Hitzalti, the Goalti, are being removed from Mitzrayim, only relate to negative liberty. Because until that point, we were constrained. Avodah Minu L'Pharaoh Mitzrayim. Pharaoh enslaved us. He was the master of our time. He was the master of our strength, our ability. So with the Hitzeisi and with the Hitzalti and with the Goalti, now we've achieved the level of negative freedom. But what is the life's goal of a Jew? What is the ambition of a Jew? The ambition of a Jew is to live a life of meaning, a life of purpose. And for a Jew, merely being free in a political sense is not enough. Where does the Jew achieve his positive freedom? That's only, number one, through Matan Torah. He receives the Torah. And this, of course, gives him the information he needs to live a life of meaning. And of course, even Eretz Yisrael is part of that. But Eretz Yisrael provides the resources for being able to live a life of meaning and purpose. And therefore, that's why the Lokachti and the Hevesi are also L'shainis of Geula. The first three L'shainis, the Hitzeisi and the Hitzalti and the Goalti, these are the three steps in achieving negative liberty. The Lokachti and the Hevesi, the next two steps, these are the steps in achieving positive liberty. This gives us the wherewithal, the resources, and the opportunities to achieve our life's goals, to live lives of purpose and meaning. That's also part of the process of Geula. And therefore, it's not that there are three L'shainis of Geula and then there are two things that follow. There are 4 or 5 L'shainis of Geula, because Geula is only complete when we are free both in the negative sense and in the positive sense. The truth is that from the perspective of the Jews, until the process was complete, it wouldn't even have made sense to say that God was behind it. In other words, let's say the process would have been aborted after the first three steps. There would have been a Vayitseisi, there would have been a Vihitzalti, there would have been a Lakachti, and that would have been it. So how would we understand that? The Rebbeinu Shalom made these miracles, these Nisim, Eser Makas, Kriyas Yamsta, for what? Just that we should be free in the most material, animal sense? It defies understanding. Only when the process was complete, when in addition to the first three steps which granted us negative liberty, did we go through the next steps which granted us positive liberty. Only then does the whole thing make sense. Only then do we understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu could possibly have been interested in it. So the pasuk says that it goes through the whole process. Step 1, and step 2, and step 3, and step 4. After step 4, after Matan Torah, then v'yadatim, then you'll understand that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu who brought about step 1. Meaning until the tachlis, until the objective is achieved, it makes no sense. Despite the fact that the miracles are dazzling, people would say it can't be. It must be perhaps some aberration in the laws of nature. It doesn't make sense that God should consciously perform these miracles in order for us merely to achieve negative liberty. Only when we achieve positive liberty through Matan Torah, now it makes sense. Now we understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu initiated the whole process. So only after at least the Lokachti, if not the Hidesi as well, but at least after the Matan Torah, now you look back and now I understand that it must have been HaKadosh Baruch Hu who started the process off, because now the process has come to its culmination, to its tachlis, to its purpose.
But we say Dayenu.
The Yenu means something else. The Yenu means that it would be enough for us to feel a sense of gratitude. In other words, if we would know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it, then we would have to be grateful for it. But the point is, I could certainly doubt that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it. That's what the pasuk is saying. If I would know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it, I have to be grateful for it. Meaning, when we go through all the steps, and the Yenu breaks it down into 15 steps, so now you can look back and say, okay, I know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did them all, so I'm grateful for each and every one. Even number 1 alone is deserving of gratitude. Number 2 alone, and number 3 alone, and number 7 alone, all of them deserving of gratitude. But if the process wouldn't have been complete, I would just have the suspicion that maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one behind it, because what would be the purpose? What would be the purpose of the Yetzias Mitzrayim that wouldn't culminate in the Matan Torah? It would make no sense. But once there's a Matan Torah, I have to be makir tov for every single step that brought me to the Matan Torah. That's what Dayenu was saying.
But the word in Dayenu doesn't say afterwards, it's almost saying if only
Dayenu says, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have taken us out of Mitzrayim and did nothing else, that would be enough for us to be grateful. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have taken us out of Mitzrayim, would I assume that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the one who took us out? That's what the pasuk is saying, that until Matan Torah, you'd have grounds to suspect that it wasn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu made all those miracles. Once you come to Matan Torah, then v'yadatim, then you'll know that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu behind it. But looking back, after I know that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, there's grounds for gratitude for each and every step of the process. Let me share with you an amazing Zayar, which I think addresses this point in a very interesting way. The Zayar is commenting on a pasuk that it says, Zacharnu es hadogo asher noichav b'Mitzrayim chinon. When the Jews were complaining about the lack of food in the Midbar, they said, we remember the fish that we ate in Mitzrayim for nothing. So what does it mean for nothing? Well, they didn't pay for it? They were slaves. Of course they paid for it with their labor. So the Zohar says, B'loi bracha. They ate the fish without a bracha. They didn't make a bracha. The Gemara also says the same thing. It was chinam min ha-mitzvahs. They didn't do any mitzvahs for the Ribono Shel Olam to deserve those fish. So what does it mean? Says the Zohar, Lo hava alona Mitzrayim oil de la'ela. We did not have the yoke of Hashem above in Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim, to the extent that we were enslaved to Paro, we could not accept the yoke of the Ribono Shel Olam. Tochazi, and I'll prove this to you. Avdin Peturim Me'ol Malchusid de la'ela. We know that Avadim, the Kanani, is potter from certain mitzvahs. First, he's potter from Priyashma, and then he's potter from all the other mitzvahs Sasei Shazman grow. So, why is that? So it's a fantastic thing the Zohar says. First, he's potter from Oil Malchusid La'ela. He's potter from accepting upon himself the yoke of Malchus Shemayim. The Aldah Peturim Min HaMitzvahs. And therefore he's potter from those other mitzvahs. It's a two-step process. First, he isn't Makabel Oil Malchus Shemayim, and because he's not Makabel Oil Malchus Shemayim, he's not obligated in other mitzvahs. How do you understand that? So the Zohar explains, my Oil Malchus Shemayim. What is Oil Malchus Shemayim? Ella, it means like this. Kahai Tura, like an ox. The Yavin like Oil B'Karamesa. First you put a yoke on its neck. Begin la'afoka minei tavla alma, so that it will bring forth good for the world. In other words, you need the ox to plow the field, to plant the grain, to produce sustenance. But to begin that entire process, you have to put a yoke. If there's no yoke on the ox will not do anything. I think we've talked about this in the past. What's the alternative to a yoke? You tie the plow with a rope to the ox's neck. So what happens if the ox takes one step forward? Choke. Right? You need the yoke to harness the energy of the ox to be able to pull the plow. If the ox doesn't accept that yoke, lo avid midi, it doesn't do anything. So he says, hachinami, and therefore here too, a person has to accept upon himself the yoke first, and after that, he can do all the work that he needs to do. All the service of Hashem needs to do. And if he doesn't accept that yoke first, he won't be able to serve the Ribono Shel Olam. And listen what the Zohar says. V'hai oil lo sharya b'man di'iyu kafis ba'achra. This yoke cannot rest on a person who is bound to others. Because if you are enslaved to a paro, for example, then this yoke cannot rest on you. You can't accept the oil malchus shemayim to the extent that you're enslaved to somebody else. The aldah, and this is why that avdim peturin me'ol malchus shemayim, and that's why the avadim who are exempt from ol malchus shemayim, the mehai oil peturim, if they're potter from that yoke, mikol shar peturim, they're also potter from all other mitzvahs, because you have to have the yoke first. And that's the meaning of the idea that they ate in Mitzrayim chinam. That whatever they had in Mitzrayim, it was chinam. They did nothing for the Ribono Shel Olam. Why did nothing for the Ribono Shel Olam? Because since they couldn't makabel the oil, they couldn't accept the yoke, because they were enslaved to Paro. Therefore, there was nothing they could do for the Ribono Shel Olam, so whatever they got was chinam. It was unearned. And this Zohar is quoted very, very, very often in Sifrei Chasidus, that the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the necessity of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, was in order to create the necessary conditions for a Kabbalas oil, for accepting the yoke of Malchus Shemayim, that would in turn enable us to live lives of Torah, lives of Avodas Hashem, but there had to be the Kabbalas oil. That could not take place in Mitzrayim. With Matan Torah, for example, could not have taken place in Mitzrayim. You ask yourself the question, why did the Baruch Hu change the whole story around? Why wasn't there a revelation in Mitzrayim of Tayag Mitzvahs and Koilus Ubrakim, and then the Yetzias Mitzrayim after that? It couldn't be. Because to the extent that you're under the yoke of Paro, there can't be an Ol Malchus Shemayim. So the Yetzias Mitzrayim is to create the conditions for Kabbalas oil, and then once we accept that yoke, then we can live productive lives of service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. talk about our discussion of negative liberty and positive liberty. There's another very, very basic distinction between the two. Negative liberty is something which is very, very personal. In other words, if I'm going to make decisions for myself, I have to be free from all constraints. It has to be a choice that I make. Even if I choose to voluntarily join a group of people in an enterprise, but it still has to be without coercion, without force. And therefore, it has to be a freedom which is absolute. It's something which is very personal, very individualistic. What do I do with that personal freedom? I may choose not to live a life of isolation. I may choose to join others. I may realize that my own ambitions can only be realized through cooperation, through partnership with others. But that decision to join the partnership only can come after there is a very, very, very strong individual freedom, which gives me the ability to make up my own mind, decide for myself, and then I can make that choice to join others. Pesach Mitzrayim. The first Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim was a celebration of the first stage of freedom. The stage of freedom which was going to take place the next day. And therefore it was something that was very private and it was very individual. It was each family in its own place, alone, celebrating that freedom. This was the decision of the individual, the family unit, deciding for itself what path it was going to choose. It's interesting that in Mitzrayim we know that many people chose not to leave. According to Chazal, Chamushim olu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, echad michamisha, echad michamishim. However we understand those midrashim, there were people that chose not to leave. Whereas this is something which every family, perhaps even every individual, had to decide for himself. The Pesach of Mitzrayim was a celebration of that individual freedom. And therefore there were halachas. There was no central place where the korban was brought. It was slaughtered in each home. It was eaten by each family in the privacy of its home. If there was a technical problem, that there weren't enough people to eat the korban, so then you were able to include other people, but even then only a neighbor, who in a way is like a member of the extended family. You know, he's so close, he lives in proximity, so it's also part of the family as well. As we all know, we're all close to our neighbors. Our next door neighbors are like members of the family. The person down the block already, he's a stranger. He can't join. That's Pesach Mitzrayim. Pesach Doiris, which of course comes after Matan Torah, is something else entirely. Because we all understand that the tachlis of our lives as Jews is only going to be realized through the sheet of Pu'ula, through the cooperation, through the joint effort of all of Klal Yisrael joining as a nation. And therefore the Pesach Doros is very different. The Pesach Doros, yes, it may be eaten in separate homes, but it's brought in one place. It's slaughtered in one place. Right? There's a kapeda, there's an insistence that even when bomas were mutter, even where the avoda of other karbanos was decentralized, but not the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach had to be brought by everybody in the same place. When you joined together to form a chabur for Korban Pesach, there was no insistence that it had to be all in the family. Here you could bring your distant relative or your faraway friend or the fellow visiting from Australia, because here it's all of Klal Yisrael joining. Kol Adas Yisrael Yasu also. All of Klal Yisrael together joins in the Korban Pesach. That's what Pesach Mitzrayim is all about. Pesach Doros rather is all about. Because we all understand that the Doros, once the Torah was given, the positive liberty which we now achieve, right, is only going to be achieved through the joint effort of all of Klal Yisrael. And therefore the Korban Pesach reflects that. There's a certain poignance, now we understand, in a very, very interesting paragraph in the Haggadah. It says in the Haggadah that the Ben Rasha comes and says, Mo ha'avoda hazois lochem. What is the purpose of this avoda to you? So the verdict, which Chazal say, is Lefi shahotzi es aso min haklal kafar be'ikr, because he removes himself from the group, so it's considered he denied a very fundamental aspect of Judaism. Now we know that kfir be'ikr normally we reserve for a person who espouses such a heresy. He denies the existence of God, or perhaps he denies some other fundamental of faith. But merely excluding yourself, merely separating yourself from the life of the tzibur, right? It's not a desirable thing, but it seems that it's a very, very harsh verdict that we pass on the Ben Rasha. And what do we tell him? We tell him, if you would have been there, you wouldn't have been redeemed. Says, what's the idea? It is exactly this. Because the purpose of the Yetzias Mitzrayim is obviously for what follows. As we said, if the mountain terror would not have taken place, everyone would have said it makes no sense. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out for what? Just to give us animal freedom? Just that we should have the level of negative liberty? That makes no sense. That's what the pasuk says, that if there wouldn't have been an ultimate mountain terror, no one would have believed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the one who took us out of Mitzrayim. Would have made no sense. For this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim. For this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made Nisim in the flows. Makes no sense. Only after the Mount Torah, it makes sense. But for the Rasha, who really chooses not to join, says, I don't want to be a part of the life of the tzibur. I'll live my own life. I'll do my own thing. So, Ilu ha'yashem lo ha'yinigol, that person would have been deserving of redemption. Because it's 100% true. The purpose of the redemption is only because of that partnership which is created by Klal Yisrael in the aftermath of Mount Torah. If you don't want to be a part of that, then you wouldn't have been a part of the redemption in the very first place. But this is something we all have to understand, that the tachlis, the Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the partnership, the shutfus of all of Klal Yisrael, the joint effort of all of Klal Yisrael. But it's also important to understand that when we talk about the joint effort of Klal Yisrael, we don't only mean the joint effort of Klal Yisrael, which is contemporary at any one given time. The cooperation, the sheet of Pu'ula, is not only of all the Jews who happen to be living in 2012. It really is the partnership of all the Jews who have ever lived and all the Jews who are going to live until the Achres Hayamim. Now, the truth is that it's the effort of all Jews spanning generations that brings about the fulfillment of the Ribono Shel Olam's plan. And therefore we are partners not only with all Jews that live today, but we are partners with all the Jews that have lived and the future generations as well. And this is why the idea of Masorah, the idea of tradition, connecting ourselves to our past and connecting ourselves to our future, is so important, dafka at Pesach, because this is the idea that the tachlis of Yetzias Mitzrayim, to live true lives of meaning, is not only going to be fulfilled through our own individual efforts, not only through the efforts of all Jews living at any given time. It's only going to be fulfilled and realized through the efforts of the entire Klal Yisrael spanning the generations. I told yesterday to a group about preparations for Pesach. And I mentioned that there are many minhagim that different groups in Klal Yisrael have maintained. People from this part of the world didn't eat X. People from that part of the world didn't eat Y. And people from this part of the world didn't eat Z. So there are all sorts of minhagim. If you have a family which has grafted onto it people of other families, let's say, for example, you have married children, so you may have sons-in-law or daughters-in-law who come from families that have these minhagim, it becomes a little complicated. Because if you have one son-in-law who doesn't eat X, and another son-in-law doesn't eat Y, and another daughter-in-law doesn't eat Z, you might find yourself in a situation where the only thing that you'll be able to serve everybody is ice cubes, and even that only made of water that was strained before Pesach. So it becomes sometimes difficult. I made the point that a lot of these minhagim were rooted in conditions that don't really apply nowadays. For example, there was a minhag in Germany that people did not eat dried fruit. This was a common minhag, not to eat dried fruit. So why was it? Because in those days, the entire year they ate fruit without supervision. There were no Darchei. People would go to the market and buy dried fruit. But the dried fruit, they suspected, in the process of drying it, it was dusted with flour. So the entire year, that's not a problem. Pesach will be a problem. So therefore, the practice was not to eat dried fruit in Germany. It was very good. But nowadays, since in addition to the dried fruit, you have who knows what additives and chemicals, so nowadays no one would eat a processed food without a hechsher. And that's pretty much safe to say. No one is going to buy a box of raisins which doesn't have a reliable hechsher that's kosher lePesach. Well, once you have a reliable hechsher that's kosher lePesach, then there's no worry about flour either. So even if you had this custom going back for generations not to eat raisins, but perhaps nowadays the conditions are different. One would consider eating raisins. Yet families hold on tenaciously to these customs. And people will not eat raisins because that's what my grandparents did, and that's what my great-grandparents did, and that's what they did all the way back. So I said that you should know that the importance of maintaining these minhagim is not so much so you'll be confident that you're avoiding any problem with chametz. Really, you can eat the raisins and you'll be also assured there's no problem with chametz. So the reason it's important to keep these minhagim is because it's important to be attached to your Masorah, to be attached to your tradition. That's the value of it. In other words, the value of maintaining these minhagim is not so much because it's an extra zehirus. Now you can be sure, I'm not going to stumble over even a mashu of chametz. Nowadays conditions are different. Probably you'd be safe even if you eat the raisins. But the idea is, but if this is what your parents did, and this is what your grandparents did, and this is what your great-parents did, and this is what they did 10 generations ago, then the act of not eating raisins has a chashivus which is far beyond the possibility of flour, which is the idea that thereby you attach yourself to a chain of tradition, a chain of Masorah. You know where you came from. And if you know where you come from, then you know where you're going to, and that has value in its own right. And I think that's really the beauty of so many of the minhagim of Pesach. Not so much because they're necessary and they provide actual safeguards. It could be conditions nowadays are such that we could even dispense with them. But the idea of attaching oneself to a chain of tradition, to a community, to a Masorah, that itself is very valuable, especially because we understand that the tachlis of freedom, the tachlis of our liberation, is not that we should be free on the individual level. Freedom on the individual level is only negative freedom. We're free to do what we want, no one is stopping us. But the freedom to live lives of meaning, to demonstrate positive liberty, means joining others to live lives of meaning. That means a connection to a community, to a Masorah, to a nation, and that is something which is very, very different. That's the idea of Pesach Doros. Pesach Doros is the knufiyah. It's everyone together. It has the mile of the carbon seaboard. That's something which is dafka after Matan Torah. In Mitzrayim, the celebration of freedom was something very individual, very private. So it's L'Doros, it's very public, it's very communal. It's the idea of carbon seaboard. It's because the truth is that the ultimate tachlis of freedom is only realized through the efforts of the cloud. Everyone should have a very, very happy and kosher and meaningful Pesach.